With me, my distinguished panel. There's no need to introduce. Their names and titles are up behind their names. Climate change, as we were discussing earlier, knows no boundaries. International cooperation is paramount to the solutions as the world pursues this huge endeavor. My panel of experts today are going to help us discuss the international cooperation of climate change, treaties, agreements, and collaborative projects. So I'm going to start directly with you, Luma. You are the Director of the Middle East and India for Principles for Responsible Investment, which is paramount to when you're talking about international cooperation. How do organizations like yours help advance the climate change agenda?
Thank you, Kim, for that. I think it's important to remind ourselves why is the word collaboration is important in the context of climate. As you said, I mean, we have. It's a global issue. It's a global problem, literally a global problem, and not one country can achieve the net zero that we want by 2050 alone. We all have to work together. So that makes it very important that there is some kind of collaboration. Now, obviously, the starting point has always been throughout that it's the UNFCCC that has been holding the two parties together to bring them together to talk about these issues, understanding that countries are different, have different economies, have different social agendas, have different priorities. And so in that context, collaboration is super important, but also each one of us has a role to play, whether you're part of UNFCCC or not. And so for the UNPRI, we are an organization, we're part of the UN family, I guess. We're affiliated or supported by the UN, but we also have an interesting point is that our members are investors, asset owners, and asset managers who together hold $121 trillion of assets under management. So that part is where we can have a lot of influence. But it's not just influence with our investors or signatories that we have. It's also part of what we do as an organization. We support the ecosystem as a whole. And with that, we work with regulators, with policymakers on how to improve the responsible investments and moving more towards green and net zero. We have, over the years, created a number of initiatives and collaborations that work towards that. One of them that I'd like to mention, which is very interesting, is a collaboration that we worked on with the Australian government. It was a pilot initiative for the past couple of years, and it was bringing together different parts of the Australian government and 25 investors from across the globe, US, Europe, and Asia, and Australia, obviously, to work together on the climate targets of Australia, how they can be improved, and of course, how the investors look at the climate risks in Australia and so on, so that to guide the government on how to improve that. And this is just one of the examples. We also have a number of net zero initiatives that we co-lead with either other UN organizations like UNFCCC. We also have a lot of collaborations with market participants like the Net Zero Asset Management Alliance, the Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance, and it goes on. It's part of our 4 pillars, collaboration, but also climate, focus on climate. And I'll stop here because I'm sure there's more.
I'm gonna go to you, Sarah, Global Ambassador, UNFCCC, because you've mentioned it a couple of times. Climate change, by definition, is transnational and requires deep cooperation, and the key is between, again, key state and non-state actors. Sarah, elaborate for that, on that for me, and coming off of what Luma said on the role of the UNFCCC.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning. So, just to put it in a really simple way, it's difficult to engage society when only specific facets of society and government are speaking to one another. So we're used to having the climate conversation. For the longest time, it was between the financial sector, governments, and part of civil society. And when you want to engage into collaboration, you have to look at the people that actually put the groundwork in it. So the UNFCCC, after the Marrakesh Partnership, decided to engage with non-state actors and enable these non-state actors, albeit companies, educational institutions, healthcare, financial institutions, individuals, activists, to be part of the design of the solution, rather than to be on the recipient end, where the solution is poised, is agreed upon, was ratified, and then delivered. And people are engaging constantly at the side of implementation. The design of the solution allows people to, first of all, be inclusive, which is a real necessity. And we have seen that not all agreements and not all treaties have been implemented successfully simply because they're not understood. They're not digested by different societies, by different cultures. The financial mechanisms are not as mature or advanced to enable people to be included in the solution. So engaging non-state actors is not only financially viable, it also gives a voice to those who are all under, vulnerable to climate change, and allows the climate change conversation to be realistic. Realistically, yes, every country has different emissions, and different sectors have different emissions and responsibilities. However, we're all affected by climate change and extremities. So engaging non-state actors is a way forward. It also allows not only for inclusiveness, but also for diversity to be represented. We all come from diverse areas, geographic areas, cultural areas, economic development areas. So diversity is essential for creating solutions that are applicable and usable and sustainable in the long run, so that we can trust the financial sector to put forward something that they can see the results happening and the results reach everyone.
Interesting. Dr. Mahamadou, let me pose this question to you about mobilization of green and climate finance. We're talking about finance here. Your company is an advocate for growth and sustainable development. How does GGI work with policymakers, governments, stakeholders, institutions to leverage international cooperation?
Thank you very much, Kim. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Please allow me to thank also the organizers for this great event. Very pleased to be here. The Global Green Growth Institute, for some of you who may not know, is a treaty-based intergovernmental international organization. Any UN member state can be a member of GGI by ratifying the treaty. So GGI has been established to support members transform their economies, transition into a green growth model. And that has a number of dimensions. So we have the policy dimensions, the green and climate finance dimension. We also have what is key to have a people-centered transition, a just transition, leaving no one behind. So as we link the policies to green and climate finance mobilization, to give you an example, answering your question, Kim, over the past 6 years, we helped member states mobilize about over $11 billion of green and climate finance, both for governments as well as non-state actors. And that's where the international cooperation comes in as an important piece. So when it comes to supporting countries, we know that governments can only do much, but to accelerate, we need to work with other players. If you look at the policy side, green and climate finance mobilization can only be accelerated if we have the smart policies in place, the policies that will give the incentive, for example, to the private sector to be involved. So GGGI works with members on policies that are either sectoral, whether it's renewable energy or sustainable transport or climate smart agriculture. So the sectoral policies are linked to national policies, what we call strategies or green growth strategies or low emission development strategies, LT-LEDs. So linking those strategies to investment plans is key. When we speak to ministers in charge of finance, the first question they ask is, how much can you help to mobilize? So green and climate finance mobilization is key. Unlocking that requires linking the policies to something that we have been helping a lot, which is developing a pipeline of green bankable projects. So having project ideas is one thing, but to get those projects market ready, to get them green and bankable so that they become accessible and interesting for investors is an important one. If I take the specific case of the MENA region that I'm covering, the 19 countries in this region, a number of countries are in conflict situation or fragile states. Mm-hmm. And the perception of risk sometimes is so high that the investors are not sometimes interested to come in. And that's why it's also something that we have been doing quite a lot in other geography is about de-risking mechanism. So having blended finance where the de-risking mechanism helps to actually reduce the level of risk that will attract the investors to come in. And the last point to include on the finance mobilization is about innovative financing mechanism. The green and climate finance for infrastructure project is good, but it's not enough. So sustainable finance is an area where from thematic bonds, green bonds to green sukuk, to debt for climate nature swap, so and biodiversity credit or plastic credit that is now included, we have a number of solutions that helps actually to accelerate the access to green and climate finance for members.
So we have a number of solutions, but they just don't seem to be implemented. And coming from my point of view, it feels like this talk has been going on since Kyoto, since Paris, and very little implementation. And I think we're talking about these treaties and agreements and collaborative projects, and there's finances that need to be involved, which is hence why you're going into the private sector, because with government, you know, it's bureaucracy and political, you know-how of trying to jockey or lobby for what the politician exactly wants. What's the solution? I feel this is such an exhausting conversation that it just goes on and on. We've been covering this in all the COPs that we've been to. This is going to be your 16th, 17th COP, Dr. Mahamadou. What's the solution on actually getting some collaboration? And I'll give it to all three of you, so whoever wants to take it.
I can try.
Yeah.
I won't be able to give you the solution.
The solution, but a solution.
A solution. Look, I think, as we're saying, this is truly a global problem. And because of the diverse nature of all of the countries involved, all of the economies involved, it is not, here's a solution and let's all do it. There's a lot of work that has to be done. And that's why we go back to saying, what is the role of every stakeholder in the ecosystem that would then together collaborate to bring the solution. And we know what the solution is. Yeah. It's net zero by 2050, right? That is the goal and the aim, and that is the solution for our problems. But how we are going to move towards that is going to be the key issue, and each organization that is here today is only one part of the
cog.
Of the ultimate solution. Exactly. It's a puzzle. It's a big puzzle.
It's a big puzzle. Sarah, let me go back to you on the Race to Zero initiative, solution to mobilizing decarbonization. We spoke about this in email on some of the questions. But you also say the race to resilience, from politics to people. Can you elaborate on that for me?
Well, let me answer the question that you just posed. What is the solution? The Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience are an attempt to try and put forward a solution. And I think one of the most basic and simple ways is to stop overcomplicating the discussion of climate change. It's predominantly scientific. The science has been there. The way it's disseminated to the public needs to be simplified. Governments are very well aware of the cost of climate climate change and climate extremities on various sectors, and all the way down to the household livelihood. One of the main things I think that can propose a solution is to localize solutions as much as possible. We have technologies that are being derived in various areas that are simply inaccessible and inaffordable for other areas. We have policies that are very sophisticated, and yet we don't have the framework to implement and regulate in other countries. Localization is the most efficient way and the most inclusive way and human rights way to implement solutions for climate change. When it comes to the race to resilience, the race to resilience is basically to maintain that people and nature are at the heart of every solution. It's to refocus why we're doing this in the first place, and to include people and communities, and to include context and biodiversity and nature-based solutions into the discussion, and keep that also at the heart of the technology that we're producing. Because when the technology is related to the people who are using it, it's going to be user-friendly. And therefore, people can apply it, and therefore, people can tolerate all of these incoming technologies and absorb them into society. And that's to maintain that focus. The race to zero is basically a pledge by all of the different non-state actors to be able to halve the carbon emissions in their sectors by 2030. The UNFCCC derived a toolkit for this. So how can you go into a sector that's sophisticated, that is pretty mature, and that it's been operating for, over a century in a particular business as usual way, and then, introduce decarbonization and then introduce laws? There has to be a mechanism for how do you start, and it moves on, from planning and pledging and actually reporting and introducing transparency and identifying who are the key players to transition into decarbonization. And I think one of the main things is to also realize that transition does have a time. You can't go from zero to hero. Transition takes time, and you have to involve, in any institution, in any company, you have to involve the people. They have to have an understanding of what you're trying to do. And I think coming from the private sector, it's just basic management to communicate the transition in the sector is essential. So I think, in short, what I'm trying to say is it's a complicated matter, and I think reducing it to basics, planning and communicating and localizing help us move forward quicker and help people also be represented quicker in that
It's almost like when you're talking about, water bottles. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody carried a water bottle. Now everybody carries a water bottle. I mean, that transition it's a very small example. But now if you look at today's generation, like my children's age, I mean, they wouldn't even contemplate not carrying a water bottle with them to fill up their water, which is a slow transition, but you're saying that incorporating the people and localizing it and making it inclusive. And I think that's really, really apparent.
Because also awareness has been heightened. There is much more in educational curriculums at an early stage. There's much more informative content out there, even down to your basic cartoons or storytelling or narration, that culturally the awareness that there is a problem and a behavioral change is starting from the onset. It's not top down, it's actually they will be more proactive.
Exactly.
And therefore, they're more aware, and therefore they're able to implement faster than our generation are.
Absolutely. Sorry.
I just wanted to pick up on localization, because that is a very important point as we discuss, the global nature of the challenge that we have, but also it's a very localized, and especially when you talk about the social impacts. Social impacts are usually very localized and very specific to countries or even regions within countries.
Just talk into your microphone, I think, because everyone can hear.
The issue that we have is that we always have to balance, and especially in the context of emerging markets, to balance the social issues with where the funds are going to come from. All of what we're talking about today requires a significant amount of money to be able to transition. And therefore, you have the issue of it's a local issue, or, for example, the social issues, but what you are today able for, especially for emerging markets, what they're able to borrow for or to get financing for is mitigation type efforts, i.e. reduction of emissions, which is not necessarily what they need the money for. And so we have to start looking at solutions that combine those two types. And one very successful, I think, initiative was the Nuwafi initiative that was initiated around COP27 by the Egyptian government at the time, where they connected the nexus of water, energy, and food, where they connected the three types of issues that they need. They could only borrow for energy, to reduction of energy, but they needed the money for water projects and also for farmlands. And so they connected the three in one project so that they could borrow mitigation, but use the money for adaptation, which is super clever. But this is the kind of initiatives that we need to study more and see how we can replicate more and more in other jurisdictions so that we deal with both. We deal with the money that is coming from somewhere to be used to help localize some of the issues and help with the local issues that are resulting from climate, which is the adaptation problem.
Mahamadou, you had something to say?
Kim, I would like to go back to the earlier points on the solutions. And it's true that the scale of the actions, the climate actions, unfortunately, is not matching the magnitude of the crisis that we are facing. If you look at, for example, the level of climate finance mobilized, it's not at the level that we would be expecting. If we want to go from billions of US dollars to trillions of US dollars needed for the climate actions, we need to change the way we are working. And the international cooperation, the theme of this session, is at the center of it. Because no matter how much resources countries have, they need to work together in order to maximize the impact of the limited resources. There are three aspects. One is the trust, second, the accountability, and the third is the transparency around the climate actions. The $100 billion per year, for example, that was promised, that never happened. So you have an issue of trust. When we go to so many of these global and regional events, commitments are made, political commitments and other types of commitments, but then we don't walk the talk after those commitments. So in a way, if we don't build that trust and accountability, the risk is that every other global event or regional event will be another event. Oh, they are going to another event. What is happening after? We are not seeing the results. That is key. We need to build that trust and accountability. And
but who is, sorry, on that question, who is the one that's holding everyone accountable when these decisions are made? And don't laugh at me, but I'm serious. We were at COP28 in in Dubai, where very big words were used, very big commitments were made. Who is holding the decision makers accountable for implementation? You know, policy is great. The biggest problem with policy is implementation. Who is holding it? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it's a joint responsibility, because it's easy to sit and for some people, some part of or some stakeholders, it's easy to sit and say, oh, it's the government responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility to come together. That's why the transparency is key. So having the mechanism that helps to track and report. Because when people are tracking, they are monitoring and they are reporting, and we see the progress, then we know where are the issues. And I think it comes down to how do we, the more stakeholders you put around the table, the more likely you have ideas that will lead to sustainable solutions. So having those stakeholders around the table include the governments in their roles as regulators, and also sometimes putting the seed funding. But we have the private sector. We know that the climate actions will never be achieved, or the climate ambitions, whether it's net zero or other ambitions which are set, we will not be able to deliver if we don't have the private sector on board. So climate actions, when they make economic sense, the private sector moves in very quickly. And they have, currently the issue is not about capital. The issue is about the quality of the project and programs and initiatives to be funded. So we need to be able to unlock and bridge that gap. So the gap in terms of capacity and the gap in terms of finance, bridging that gap requires that we actually unlock that capital. But my last point on also the accountability is that I think way too often stakeholders sometimes sit and just expect to be beneficiaries. They are change agents, not only beneficiaries. So everyone has a role to play. And as Sarah mentioned, localized solutions. We have seen that in many cases. So it doesn't need to be large-scale, big interventions all the time. Sometimes localized, small-scale solutions, success stories are out there, and scaling them up, scaling them out are part of the solutions.
I love that, and Luma was itching to answer.
Yes, because I really would like to emphasize the point around what all of this is going to mean for us economically, and that is what I believe is going to drive private investments. What I'm trying to say is that we need to get out of this idea of it's just a scary thing, what's going to happen in 2050, and it makes it so far out. What we really need to focus on is what it really means for the financial systems. Every time some kind of a disaster happens, you look at what happened in Pakistan, look at the floods that happened here in Dubai only a few months ago. The economic impact, for example, insurance. What happens now to insurance premiums in all of these areas where you have had these disasters? They're going through the roof. What that means is that companies, investors, all of them need to truly take into account climate risk. Whether you believe in it or not, I think is not important. What you need to know today is that climate risk is financial risk, and therefore, from a fiduciary duty point of view for investors and for corporates, you need to take that into account to assess how it impacts your company and therefore act on it. And that's what might, hopefully, move capital.
It's so interesting that you say that, because Mahamadou and I were talking earlier about that in parts of Canada, houses are not even getting insured because insurance companies don't want to take that liability, which is also quite sad that until it hits them financially in the pocketbook and investors, and board members have to take on this fiduciary responsibility, or a publicly traded company is losing money, then it seems that the climate change conversation is of interest, which is quite prolific of where we stand. But Mahamadou, you spoke about that again.
Exactly. So I think it's the climate crisis, and in many instances I think we came a long way to see that there is a consensus that climate crisis is a reality. From investors to government to policymakers to academia, the science behind climate change is known and it's a reality today. The frequency of the weather events and the intensity, unfortunately, are creating a new situation. In some places, for example, in Canada, there are neighborhoods that used to have property insurance and they cannot have it anymore. Because the areas are flooded and the insurance company don't want to insure those areas. For some of my friends who are trying to sell their houses, they can't because the prices are so low, because the areas are considered flooded area over the past couple of years. So, and this is going to happen more and more. For financial institutions, there is the risk of having assets that they cannot, unfortunately, value simply because of the climate crisis. So the climate risk, when they are not taken into consideration in the decision-making from financial institutions, that becomes a major risk factor. Now, there is no negative correlation between financial performance and sustainable development. The two can go together. So in a number of countries where we work, governments are focusing on, creating jobs. And that's where we need to look at how do we take the challenges of climate change impact and translate into opportunities. If I take the case of renewable energy, we know that solar energy, for example, is getting much cheaper compared to fossil fuel energy. It's an example. And for some countries that are a big importer, they are investing a lot in renewable energy. So the diversification of energy sources is part of the solution. But the job creation is a key part of it. Between 2020 and 2022, we work with a number of countries to green the recovery from COVID. Because during COVID, and this is an example, I think, to illustrate that there is no issue of capital. In the first 6 months of COVID, close to 12 or 13 trillion dollars were mobilized by different economies, mostly advanced economies. That shows that the capital is there. When there is the political will, you can mobilize the funding. So in less than 6 months, over 12 or 13 trillion dollars were mobilized. So what we did with a number of countries is to say, they are taking a lot of money, but how do you make sure that the recovery is green? By greening the recovery, we did some analysis with countries like Mexico, Indonesia. So we were able to show that actually in greening the recovery, they create more jobs, green jobs, than if they were doing business as usual. So in a way, the job creation is an important aspect, and that I think many government officials want to have those numbers. How many jobs can you create by transitioning from business as usual to green in the energy sector, in the transport sector, in agriculture? So Luma talks about the nexus between water, energy, food. When you look at that nexus, climate smart agriculture is one of the solutions for food security. Climate risk insurance will help farmers to actually cope with weather events. So a combination of solutions helped actually to address the issues. It's not enough, unfortunately, but the good news is that we know how to make it work. But to actually make it work, it requires that international cooperation and the commitment to accelerate the delivery of the climate action.
Sarah, you wanted to comment on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're trying to propose is something that, again, the issue of climate change and the risk it has on livelihoods still remains very conceptual. Okay, although it is felt at the livelihood level, I think domesticating the cost of climate change onto communities and also really showing people how much is lost, how much is not managed, how much potential can there be by localizing solutions is essential at the moment. I mean, let me give you an example of the various sectors. For the longest time, we have been talking about global emissions by sector. And therefore, we are talking about oil and gas. And then recently, the conversation shifted to 40% of global emissions belong to the construction sector.
Imagine.
This is a huge amount. We have to look at the entire value chain. We're creating products like homes and buildings. It's the fastest growing in-demand product, and we still haven't allowed the whole value chain into the conversation. From the architects to the industries that build building materials to the construction sector to the info sector and appliances sector. So I think being sector specific, understanding the value chains, communicating this to individuals and allowing the entrepreneurial of the local community, the entrepreneurial imagination and innovation of the young people to start resolving and coming part of the conversation and enabling the finance for them will be a game changer in the stagnation of financing.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we have to wrap up so quickly, but thank you to my distinguished panel. It was a pleasure. This conversation could have been another hour at least. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.